All right, Samra, making you a co-host. Ben, same thing.
Audio, can't tell. Guess we'll find out. Do you mind closing the door? I don't know if anyone else is gonna be coming in, but I don't want to bother the class across the hall.
Hi, folks. Welcome to the Catalyst webinar number 2. This is on AI and assessment. And um, wait for another probably minute or two for folks to drop in. But in the meantime, I do have some questions that I was hoping you could respond to just in the chat, and just feel free throughout the session just to continue asking questions in the chat. But as a way to kick things off, just a few questions for you. How has AI impacted your assessment strategies? This question is probably mainly for faculty here, but many of us are creating assessments in some fashion or another. Have you changed anything since the launch of ChatGPT? What seems to be working or not working? So if you have any responses to that, just go ahead and throw that in the chat. Heidi is a fellow catalyst, and yeah, more process-oriented assessments. Absolutely, we'll talk about that today. Jennifer have used AI for a lesson, text, and idea generation, not yet for assessment or detailed assessments. From Shauna. Kevin, I have students more specific I asked students to be more specific with numbers and especially formats. Interesting. Yeah, and kind of points out like, testing centers. Um, we'll talk about this actually. So testing centers can be really useful in the AI era, and I think there's still kind of a role for that. Yeah, Ryan kind of chiming in with the proctoring situation, and then Liza. Um, it's changing quite a bit. Yeah, my essay feedback is a great tool. All right, continue responding. You know what? I should have changed the ding thing in my settings, but I'm gonna move on, and I know there'll be a slowdown in those dings as we continue. I'm gonna start recording here. Liza, would you be able to record to the cloud? I'm gonna record to my computer just in case, or
Did
someone
you
record to the
did
cloud.
you want me to record it to the cloud?
Oh, it's automatically recording. It is.
Okay, so you've got it.
Yep.
Okay, good. I'm not sure my Wi-Fi is good enough for that today.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, good. All right, so this is the second webinar in the series that we'll be doing as part of the Idaho AI Catalyst Initiative, which is funded and organized by Heidi Estrom, the newly chief academic officer at the Office of the State Board of Education. Our North Star is to empower faculty as we navigate AI readiness. The second webinar will provide a basic framework for updating assessments for the AI era, including a few examples from our catalysts. And we see this here, the presenters for today. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you see all of the catalysts. So there are 8 catalysts representing the 8 public higher ed institutions. I'm the AI lead for the group. Again, I apologize for the dings. I should have toggled that setting. And today I'll be presenting with Benjamin Norton from Lewis Clark State College, Bert Baumgartner from the University of Idaho, and Sam Rokulum from the College of Southern Idaho. This is our agenda. And something I'll hand out you'll get the slides afterwards, but note that there's gonna be a lot of resources sprinkled throughout, and I highly recommend referring to those resources later. So keep that in mind. One qualification here so this presentation is entirely about AI assessment strategies, and it does assume some prior familiarity with GenAI tools and skills. We did a webinar on that. That was kind of our first webinar. So refer to that GenAI starter pack slides and recording for help with those foundations, if you would like some of that. Okay, so let's jump in. I'm going to present on the kind of frameworks and policies, or sorry, frameworks and principles and foundations, and then the other catalysts are going to go through and provide examples of kind of what this actually looks like. So I'm gonna tackle things at a high level, and then we'll look at examples, right? So there are 2 layers to updating your courses for AI, right? So one, there's going to be clarifying how AI should be used within a course, and here AI policy frameworks are essential. And then the second layer is redesign assignments and courses to foster the behavior you actually expect. Um, okay, good. I'm looking at the chat here. Ryan says he's not hearing the ding, so it might just be the co-host. Good. And then someone actually, now that I'm thinking about it, if some of the catalysts could kind of monitor the chat and let me know if I need a response to anything. Feel free to cut me off and say, hey, there's something in the chat you need to address. Faculty hate cheating. So, why don't we start there, right? One of the reasons policy frameworks are important is that adopting clear and effective policies will also help mitigate one of the most common reasons students use AI in ways we consider, cheating. They clarify acceptable use. And this is actually a really fantastic book about this. I highly recommend it. Recently published, I think a few months ago. In my experience, most faculty who struggle with enforcing their AI academic policy, especially if it's the no AI policy, we'll look at that next, are either unaware of how unclear it is or don't realize that it's impossible to enforce. especially in like asynchronous courses. This is, you know, kind of a big problem. So how do we reduce confusion? That's what I want to like tackle first. And this is kind of like the one layer of thinking about AI and assessment. So to help provide clarity, many institutions have adopted this three-tiered approach. Not all, but it's becoming more common. I think there's no, I don't know exactly how many institutions that in Idaho have done this. I know a number have, including CWI, perhaps BSU, but others maybe correct me and maybe in the chat kind of clarify if your institution has something like this. But these are course level AI policies, right? These would show up in the syllabus. This is one way to provide clarity. A few things to keep in mind here. So we have kind of this tier from most restrictive all the way to least restrictive. I've bolded kind of the key language there. And if you would like to look at this later, again, this link at the bottom is an OER textbook chapter that includes the language and kind of like clarification, like what this actually means. A few notes though, the most restrictive policy isn't possible to enforce for work done outside of class. Like you can tell students like, hey, don't do this, but you can't actually enforce that, right? Faculty who expect students to adhere to this for every single task, both in class and at home, are creating a situation where students will absolutely cheat all the time. We're creating that situation if we expect students to apply this to every single task. Even the least restrictive policy, on the other hand, has rules and requires support. I think this is like the opposite kind of mistake that we sometimes make. Most notably, there are expectations around acknowledging AI use. So we'll talk a little bit about this. Students often won't know how to do this, how to acknowledge AI use. So you'll need to provide a template. This chapter, this link here, includes a template borrowed from Monash University. So you'll need to provide a template and clear expectations throughout the course. Acknowledgement statements can be built into cover letters and appendices. And actually, both APA and MLA now distinguish between citing AI use versus acknowledging it and point out like, hey, you can include these in appendices and cover letters. There's not a fixed way to do this. When you ask a student, so some just clarification here, when you ask a student to explain their use of AI and how it impacted a submission, that's an acknowledgement statement. When you ask the student to clearly cite anything in a submission that's from a chatbot, that's a citation. So that's kind of like, this is not a distinction we're used to, but this distinction is becoming more common and is really helpful for explaining your policies. Yeah, and that's yeah, Heidi, yes. Finally, it's taken, I think in the past year, finally, MLA and APA have kind of been updating things. So that's at the course level. Syllabus policies are just the beginning because they operate at the course level, right? And this is another key distinction that it took me a while to kind of figure out as well. But what actually happens in most courses is faculty who are strategic about learning will require some assignments to be done unassisted. And you'll see that today from our Catalyst. And these help demonstrate mastery, just unassisted, doing a task. While other tasks can be assisted by AI, or students may even be required to use AI tools as part of their learning. And so notice like Leon Furs, I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, but he's done a lot of work on this. He was kind of a co-developer for the AI assessment scale that you see here. But note his suggestions. So some assessments should permit or explore the use of AI, and this is key, only when it does not get in the way of learning outcomes. So it's not just like a free-for-all. And on the other hand, every assessment cannot be at level 1, no AI, right? That's just not possible. It's unfair and unrealistic. This means your course level syllabus policy must be complemented by assignment level explanations. And in fact, assignment level clarity is probably more important than what's in your syllabus. So the syllabus kind of points to like, hey, throughout the course, I'll specify, these kind of like range of different levels of AI use. And so you'll have, students need to remain kind of attuned to like what's going on at the assignment level. There are other assessment scales, just like a traffic light system. You might be familiar with other options here, but the AIAS has become one of the most highly adopted frameworks for how to tag individual assignments because it does a really good job of like providing clear expectations for students. So what integrity actually looks like for each assignment. And it also explains the why. And I think this is important, right? Like, how does it actually help with learning? Uh, so I really want to emphasize this because, like, I see this happen so many times. If you discursively, so in other words, as mainly a way to mitigate cheating, your AI policies will absolutely fail because they rely on compliance and honest self-reporting, and this leads to an enforcement illusion. Like we're just telling students, like, hey, tell me you didn't use AI. That's essentially what we're doing. But that's not effective, right? So any AI policies must be coupled with structural rather than merely discursive changes. And this is the second part to the second layer of AI and assessment is thinking about like, okay, how do I actually, how my policy, my frameworks, I know like, how to say this is, proper use of my course, but how do we actually redesign for AI to encourage the kinds of behaviors we want from students, right? Um, I've completed, a lot of trainings on AI assessment, redesign, and built several courses for AI resilience. In the past year, we've had to do a lot of course redesigns in my own programs. And so here's what I've learned as in a series of kind of four pillars. I'll suggest like these are the four main pillars of redesigning for AI. And you'll see examples from our Catalyst of what this actually looks like, but I want to go over them first. I'll actually start with pillar three. Um, the move from merely mitigating improper AI use to structuring your course to ensure the behavior you're expecting actually happens. Like that's kind of the difference between mitigating use, cutting down on quote unquote cheating and actually encouraging the behavior you want from students. Um, this requires revising summative assessments so they rely much less on compliance and much more on self-motivation, right? And the concept of authentic assessments is meant for this. It basically means like open-ended projects grounded in real-world context and the student's personal experience, as opposed to assessments that look for the objectively correct answer. Unpacking the entire range of authentic assessments would be like an entirely separate training. We can do that if there's kind of a clamoring for it. We can dedicate a webinar to that. But for now, I'm going to link to Chris Ostro's, I think, University of Colorado or the Colorado State network of campuses. I forget which one, but he has an excellent series of slides on this. So I linked to that there. So I would refer to that. And then Samra and Ben will actually provide examples of what this looks like as well. UDL, so Authentic plus UDL, Universal Design for Learning. This actually works, rather well with authentic assessments because the framework allows for individual differences. And again, that the slides will kind of provide clarity on that. What's key here is that it's increasing self-motivation, moving away from just compliance. The second pillar is process oriented. So this means, pillar two means that these key assessments are carefully scaffolded. So students actively track the process of investigating and creating solutions to a problem. So like it's a process and students are tracking this. So a key part of the deliverable, this would be the summative assessment, includes the students' reflections that analyze the methods in order to articulate their own method of learning, right? Four, I moved down to pillar four here. AI augmented is about providing experiences and presumably as part of the authentic assessment, but not always. It could just be separate from that summative assessment. But providing these experiences that require students to use one or more AI tools and then assess the quality of their interaction. And here, and Bert's going to actually show an example of this. Students can either challenge AI or co-create with it. So it doesn't have to be like, oh, you're using AI as a tutor. It could be you're challenging AI outputs. Kevin's providing an updated version of Leon Furz's scale. And then pillar one, this might be, some folks like say, hey, synchronous proctored assessments are just, entirely, just outdated. They're not really useful. I think most of the evidence I see suggests that they actually are still really important. And most of the research, all the books that I've read still says like, hey, this is the gold standard for validity. And this is about using synchronous or proctored assessments strategically in order to demonstrate mastery. it's still like it still remains a gold standard for validity, right? Oral assessments, going to a proctored testing center in class, that kind of stuff, right? There's no perfect assessments that's going to mitigate all the undesirable behavior. Students can still cheat, do things that we don't like. It might be, it's certainly unfair to rely too heavily on proctored exams, but the highest quality research again shows that these situations remain the best way to ensure mastery. Not going to spend too much time on this slide, but this recent update to Bloom's taxonomy of learning in terms of AI can be helpful for articulating the learning outcomes for AI augmented assessments. Some folks like lean pretty heavily on Bloom's taxonomy to kind of like spell out and create the rubrics and all these things. And this white paper here, Clark 2025, went through and said like, hey, here's what Bloom said, here's the traditional taxonomy, here's how we might interpret that in terms of AI. Uh, this is also going to be quick, but when we think about assessment, we're thinking about the assignment level, the course level, and the program level. And I just want to point this out because at the program level, for example, you can use the program level to think about like, hey, maybe we should ensure that periodically throughout a program, there's going to be a major proctored assessment. And that's how we're going to determine mastery, right? Maybe you don't have the luxury of having proctored assessments in every single course. You might hit that at the program level. And then finally, so after, I mean, this is kind of how my brain works. Like I want to think about when I'm thinking about principles, foundations, pillars, that kind of stuff. I want to think like, okay, how do I get started? So, for me, this is kind of a workflow you could adopt for updating an assessment or a course. This isn't how you have to do it, but this is one way I think that would work pretty well. Um, so you could start from, one, redesign summative assessments so they're authentic and process oriented. And to make this like very straightforward, this is a sample prompt you could use. And it's key here. I think this is really important. Make sure, feed the chatbot, GPT-5 thinking mode. I would toggle the thinking mode on whatever platform you use. Make sure you're using that. Feed it your course outcomes, an updated version of Bloom's taxonomy for AI, presentation on authentic assignments, right? And your current summative assignment instructions. And then you're asking it to propose different ways to revise the assignment instructions so it works as process-oriented and authentic. And make sure it also aligns with UDL recommendations. Like if you do that, you're going to get you should get like fairly interesting results. And then two, the next step would be identify other opportunities for AI augmentation, either by challenging AI outputs or using it to assist learning. Three, consider like, now that you've got your authentic assessments figured out, like, okay, where do I need to demonstrate, where do students absolutely need to demonstrate mastery? Here, you might want to use synchronous sessions or proctored situations, again, strategically and not all the time. And then finally, go back and make sure you're labeling things according to the IAAS. That's difficult for me. That framework, and then add acknowledgement templates. And I linked to this. I actually linked directly to Monash here if you want to look at what those templates look like. And students really do need this. Like they will not understand how to acknowledge AI use. All right, I'm gonna let Ben take over, and now we're gonna get into like, hey, what does this actually look like at the assignment level?
All right, thanks, Joel. Yeah, I'm going to be thinking specifically if Joel talks about this broad framework, and I'm just going to be sharing an assignment I've actually used. I'm in my class. I use this in a capstone research course. It deals with bibliographies. I'm borrowing and definitely inspired by an example from this really great free ebook. If anybody wants to check this out from Utah State, you can download the PDF or just read it online here. Um, but this could be used for, an English 101 course, an intro to research course, any course I think that involves research. And I'll talk about why, I think bibliography is a great assignment to use this theme that we're going to be talking about today, which is taking an original assignment, You've somewhat become frustrated because students are just plugging in or finding answers on ChatGPT or whatever a large language model they're using, and then adapting that, right, for this world that we now live in, where we know a lot of students, they're the biggest use category of large language models that we have. So living in that world, how are we going to essentially incorporate those same goals or those goals that we've always incorporated in teaching? And two of those goals that I'm going to be talking about are discovery and source evaluation as they relate to rethinking bibliographies. And as Joel pointed out, we have this really great assessment scale. Kevin Rank from BSU, a man who is never lacking any useful links, has dropped a link in the chat. So go check it out for an updated version of that. And I'm really happy to see that it includes this newer category of AI exploration on there, because I think this is a way that students have already been using these tools, and I think it's one way that we can encourage students to use it, especially in a research assignment like I'll talk about, to emphasize the process of discovery throughout research, because it's a great way to find novel questions. I think that's a one goal that we all have in the research process. So I want to talk about bibliographies because large language models are really, really good at doing research in the sense that they can find answers, right, to teacher prompts. I remember this moment early on when I saw in late 2022 other folks posting on Twitter then about how good these models were. And I literally went in and plugged my prompts for questions, papers, and I was like, this is pretty good, right, at converging on this one specific answer. But today I'm going to be talking about how we can try and encourage students to begin in the same area, like ask a novel or interesting research question based on past research, and how do they go off in their own different directions to ask unique questions. I think that's something that we can all get behind. So, this process of research really has little to do with finding answers. And instead, I think the goal for most of us is this process of discovery, which can include new questions instead of finding answers. V has a really, really great term for this productive uncertainty, that moment when you're going through something like, Socrates says, the more we learn, the less we know, right? That's really, really useful and productive. And also to see how students' ideas can evolve instead of merely supporting their argument, beginning with a thesis, going out and finding things that agree with that, right? What disagrees with it, or even what's missing, what questions aren't here. So why bibliographies? First off, they're really, really vulnerable to AI abuse, something we don't like, because they're really, really good at summarizing things. We've all been there. We don't have time to read the full article for a meeting maybe we've been in, or even probably especially like policy documents. And we want to kind of get the gist of some of the most important or most significant points. So the goals of discovery and source evaluation in mind, what I'm going to be presenting here and showing an example of are ways in which we can rethink bibliography to kind of be in conversation or discourse with this world, this real world that we're in, of students using AI, as well as a lot of teachers getting into using AI to adapt some of their assignments. So bibliographies, traditionally, we've always foregrounded discovery, and I think that's a process that we want to continue in the future. Students often complete, reflections assignments, like this is one that I literally have before this ChatGPT moment, that include questions such as, how did you come across your sources? Maybe where did you find them? Or did you find them from like the work cited of a previous source? How'd you evaluate which ones to accept or which ones to reject, especially when we're talking about research on the web? Which sources cause you to rethink or adapt your thesis or argument, right? Which ones took you kind of in a new direction? And I think that AI can not only be useful to work in concert, with the student's individual thinking in these questions, but I think they can also take them into new, really useful and fruitful directions. So if AI is really good at summarizing these individual research sources, I think the goal of bibliography writing becomes less about summarizing those sources correctly, right? Something that's easy for the AI, and more about discovering new types of sources for a particular project, or new types of questions that maybe the student didn't think of at the beginning of their process. So instead of summary, or even in addition to it, students can be asked to write a paragraph, right, that brings together, right, in addition to that summary, their reaction to the source information, like, wow, I was really surprised, right? These can be emotional reactions, like, I didn't agree with this author, but I understand where this author was coming from, right, given their points. maybe even also how the source can relate to their research question, something that I think is always crucial for a bibliography. You can summarize a book, but summarizing that book for your particular research question, that book may not be pointing specifically at your research question, but there's data that you can glean from a chapter or two that does point to questions that you want to answer in your research question. And lastly, this reflection can also include an analysis of which voices are most significant, influential, and important to understanding on that research question. So we're talking about who are the major players in this field, or why is their work so groundbreaking at this particular point in time. And one thing that I've been seeing in the chat, right, teachers are constantly thinking about, how can I ask students something that the AI can't do? How can I ask students to kind of follow through on something that I know can be easily, be done with AI? And this is where documentation becomes really important. So instructors should model this process of documentation and the process of reflection and probably go through multiple iterations of this. Samara is going to be talking about a 5-week assignment. I think this one could be done in a similar range, maybe even 3 to 5 weeks. And over that time, you'll have multiple iterations of these assignments throughout. And the end goal is to document all of the students' sources on a written or a visual map, literally a visual map of their research. So sources not placed in a single line from top to bottom on a piece of paper, but maybe all over the paper, maybe clumped together, however that student thinks that those sources should be organized. And they could be organized by things like, how is each source related to another source? Maybe it's on subject matter. Maybe it's in chronology, you'll see an example of. Which sources are speaking to others, not literally in their text, but which sources do the students argue are speaking to other sources, even if they were never existing at the same time of their publication. So this research map is important, as part of this documentation process, and then is also followed by a reflection back to their original research question and how that research question has evolved since the beginning, middle, and end stages of their bibliography. Students can reference their research map in their reflection, showing where lines are connected or multiple lines are pointing. You can ask, what did you learn about the research question, and what would you do differently in the future, right? If you could start back over kind of from the beginning. And an example of one of these maps, kind of extracted from the explanations, is one on a student's research question for a capstone, project in my communication course. So their question began, how does the long take communicate in the language of motion pictures? And the long take, for others of us that don't study kind of film or cinema, it's just a shot that continues throughout space and time in a movie and does not have a cut or an edit that interrupts that shot. It's one continuous shot. And usually it's done for an artful purpose, but this student is wondering, I think the student was just really interested in long takes and wanted to see, but also the student was interested in where they came from and kind of how they evolved. And so you can see on the left-hand side here, you have some kind of, famous authors like Andre Bazin, who wrote about film. David Bordwell's Film Art is a pretty standard textbook for an intro to film class. And then you can see how that student evolved into finding other research sources. But one thing that the student did that was really, really creative in that kind of moving away from convergent finding the answer kind of thinking to divergent finding really interesting questions is when the students saw all of their sources on a map kind of like this, they realized that there were a bunch of things left out, right, when describing how long takes communicate and especially what they were influenced by. So what this student's noticed is that through that process of research and maybe even researching in consultation with a large language model like ChatGPT, the model focused specifically on film as a discipline or film as a subject because that's probably what the prompt included. But the student noticed that what was missing from all of this were connections to television, especially live television, which is literally one long take sometimes, especially if they're just using one camera, or connections to theater, or even connections to sports where they might have like a camera on a gimbal and introducing or going with players entering the field. So there were all these other interesting connections that the students said, we're not seeing those, right, with this, cursory or introduction look at the bibliography on film one takes. And that led them into an entirely new direction to change essentially their research question that began with how does the long take communicate in the language of motion pictures to this kind of discovery at the end. how have theater, television, and other media influenced how the long take communicates in the language of motion pictures? And that really opened up for the student a kind of, mind-blowing moment where they could say, I'm doing something that seems a little bit more original than I thought when coming to this. I'm not trying to find what other people are saying, how the take communicates. I'm trying to argue what I think the long take communicates in relation to these other research questions. So to review, this is an example of, AI task completion, human evaluation, because the student is using what is computed or spit out by the summaries of the different research articles that they're researching, and they're trying to critique, criticize, or show, in this case, what is absent from that process. So next up, you're going to hear from Bert, who's going to talk about a really, really, really cool tool that he's developed for his Intro to Ethics course.
Hi, everyone. Excuse me. My name is Bert Baumgartner. I'm a professor at the University of Idaho, and I'm going to show you an example of how I've sort of redone a kind of assignment in an online Introduction to Ethics class. The example I'm going to show you is part of the sort of no AI segment. So there are other sections of the course where I do allow students to sort of use AI to the extent that they want to, but this is an example where I wanted to sort of use AI to augment a kind of assignment. So I'm going to be talking about at the assignment level. So in a sort of typical online context, and maybe with other kinds of course activities, right, especially for the online context, multiple choice quizzes are sort of really good for sort of objective and efficient grading. You can get a lot of broad coverage of content. But they do tend to have sort of more super surface level knowledge. They do tend to be susceptible to guessing. And of course, in the age of AI, it's super easy for students to just copy and paste them into a chatbot and get the answers for them. And they tend to be highly accurate. Another alternative is our discussion boards, especially for online context. They can be asynchronous. They do require, some more deeper reflection. They can be more inclusive in terms of how they engage students who might otherwise be shy in an actual in-person context. But here too, there's some downsides, right? The contributions can be superficial, or there can be a large variety of different kinds of contributions. They can be really challenging to assess, and they're very, very, time consuming. In the sort of more ideal context of what I kind of like is to have a sort of TA-led discussion section or TA-led sort of, grading of short papers or discussion of short papers. Here, students would get the kind of personalized interaction and feedback. You get some active learning. They, can build a sense of community. But there are also downsides with that as well. It can be lots of inconsistent quality depending on who the TA is. It can be less inclusive for students that are more introverted. And there's also, all these logistical challenges of like trying to schedule these things, and they typically aren't used in an online context. But most importantly, you need a graduate program to have TAs to be able to conduct these sorts of things. So here's what I sort of needed and wanted as I was designing or this online Intro to Ethics class, especially because we don't have a graduate program. I wanted a tool that would incentivize students to sort of engage with the material more deeply. So here I'm trying to draw on the fact that discussion boards can be, more effective than quizzes. But I also wanted to have some kind of standardization and efficiency, right? This is the advantages of quizzes over discussion. The other thing I wanted to sort of start capitalizing on is this feature that most of us sort of experience, and students I think experience as well, is you sometimes think you know something, but then when you have to teach it to someone else, you realize that, oh, there's all sorts of gaps in my understanding, and I come to understand things better as I try to teach or explain it to someone else. And so that's something else that I wanted to see if I could actually make use of. So the tool that I helped sort of develop, there's a website for this, mrbays.ai, and I'll have a link for you towards at the end. The idea is to have actual students interact with certain kinds of chatbots, where these chatbots are playing the role of a kind of Socratic virtual student, where that sort of virtual student or VS is also in the class. They're not like ChatGPT or other AI systems that are meant to be helpful. In fact, they're sort of confused about something, and it's the actual student that needs to sort of explain and help the virtual chatbot learn something. They're intended to be sort of more advanced than the custom GPTs that you might be able to make, design with OpenAI's tools, or I think Google has ones that they call GEMs. The sort of key things that you need to design one of these virtual student Socratic chatbots is some background reference material, like an excerpt from a reading or something about your lecture notes that might not have appeared online. Some kind of character role. So here the idea is that the confused student would have a kind of sticking point. They don't understand something. And then there's a learning objective, like the actual student might need to use an argument by analogy or some distinction that is found in the text. They need to use that to give the virtual student chatbot this sort of like aha moment. Oh, now I finally understand what it is that you're talking about. And then a really important feature too is that there's this overseer that we call Mr. Bayes that can both steer and evaluate the dialogue. And so if you're familiar with, building these sort of like in-depth rubrics that might have some kind of like feedback, this is the kind of thing that we're thinking about here. So what I wanted to do is sort of, I've given you this high level description so far, but I wanted to actually give you like a little bit of a demo of how we've used this. So here's a playful example. This is a unit on virtue ethics. And here we're actually using the film Groundhog Day to illustrate this. So we've had a virtual student, or it's not really a virtual student in this case, but there's a chatbot after Phil Connors in this film who is at the point where he's absolutely desperate to get out of the loop that he's in of waking up in the same situation every single day. So students would be presented with this instruction, and we know in the class, right, there's this learning objective that we want students to be able to make a connection to virtue ethics. And that's what's going to help them explain to Phil Connors, the simulated Phil Connors, escape. So here's I'm not going to read this text, but I'm just going to show you that students would see this kind of text, right? This is from Phil Connors, sort of explaining what his situation is. And then he's asking at the end, so tell me what it is that I'm supposed to do. And now it's the student's turn to try to explain to Phil Connors, like, what does he need to do to escape this loop? So a student might ask, have you tried praying, asking for forgiveness, or maybe converting to various religions, right? That's one kind of response that students might give, especially if they haven't watched the film yet. And so here I'm showing you something that the students don't see, but I think is important from an instructor's perspective, is like we have this sort of routing in the background that happens where we categorize the kinds of responses that students give, which then gets sort of like an intermediate sort of assessment by Mr. Bayes. And then Mr. Bayes can actually then send instructions to the chatbot for how to respond to that kind of response that they gotten from the actual student. So this gives us sort of a way to sort of control and sort of keep the dialogue on a certain kind of path that we want the students to have as we're trying to get them to meet this learning objective. So what you see in the green is actually not what the user would see, but this illustrates the things that are going underneath the hood that the instructor has sort of control for beforehand. And in here, what I'm now showing you is the response that you would get from Phil Connors, right? You're starting to see clues of like what the actual student needs to do to make some progress towards learning objectives. So what I'm showing you here is Phil Connors saying, surely there must be some logic behind this madness, some scientific explanation or cosmic rule book I haven't cracked yet. Until then, I'm stuck here. And here again, right, the student might now say something very generic, might say, oh, you need to sort of become an excellent person, you need to help other people, you need to develop skills, and you want to make sure that these habits become kind of automatic. So here the student is sort of starting to make progress towards identifying some of the key things about virtue ethics, which is the development of good habits. And that becomes sort of like makes partial progress towards what we want them to have in terms of the learning objective. And what I'm showing you here is like that's actually not quite like achieving or satisfying the learning objective that we want. They've made some good progress, but we're actually going to give the student another Socratic hint, right? So what this simulated Phil Connor says is what connects all this self-improvement stuff directly to escaping this loop? Is there a hidden formula where goodness equals freedom? That's the kind of Socratic hint that we're giving to the student to meet the learning objective. And then here, finally, the student or the student that I'm pretending to be, I'm saying, you don't have to be perfect, Phil Connors. The point is that you become a human to the best point that you can, and it's a development of those skills and those good habits that lead you to personal fulfillment, and it's personal fulfillment that allows you to escape the loop. right? And once I've said this, now the dialogue gets assessed and says, hey, okay, you've met the learning objective. That's what we wanted to get you to. So we've done some, preliminary assessment to see how students are what their experiences are like from their perspective. We are getting lots of really good feedback that they're finding it to be quite positive, and especially when compared to discussion boards, students this 100 level introduction to ethics class seem to be big fans of it. Uh, this is me having developed some of these things with the developer. We're really looking to come get more people involved in this to come help develop this tool. So I invite you to go to Mr. Bay's AI to try out a demo. I'll be upfront. I'm a co-founder of this, but I don't receive any royalties. The money that does come in is to help for paying the developer and help recoup some of the compute cost that we have to pay for. So I'll leave this here, but please do reach out to us and try out some of the demo. We're sort of keen to help keep developing these kinds of assignments. And I believe next up we have Samra.
Do you see my slides okay? Okay, perfect. So thanks, Bert. I was super excited when he first showed us to that. It just my brain was going in so many different directions. So I really encourage everybody that if you got excited like me to really kind of be a part of that. What I wanted to do is I wanted to kind of share about what the process of redesign looked like for me. I think sometimes we show our end products, but I just wanted to show you my thinking process for an educational technology class that I teach. It's aimed specifically for elementary and secondary teachers. And the real big purpose of this class is how do they integrate technology into their teaching practices? So, something very similar to what we're doing today. For mine, I used level 4 that Ben kind of showed you as well. And it was really, I used AI to complete tasks and actually enhance their creativity. Because I felt like a lot of my students got stuck at the first portion of this big unit assignment that we would work on. And it kind of either went great or went downhill real fast. And one of my big goals is, to recreate what Bert was talking about is these like aha moments for my students. And it can be really challenging in the time of AI. And so to kind of frame this thinking, if you can, maybe you think of your own class, maybe think of an assignment that you absolutely love. It was one of your favorite assignments. It always felt like you got really excited about it. You think it fits your outcomes, or at least, you're under that perception. But maybe the students keep missing the point, or there's a lot of big discrepancy in the quality of work. Either they do really well or they do really poorly, and the highs and the lows are really distinct. Or maybe thanks to AI, it's no longer what it used to be. It's just something that now you're just, dreading, looking at this assignment because it's not what I wanted to do. So that's where I started with my thinking process, is like, how might I redesign using AI? So I took that mirror to myself. And the thing that I've focused on in this educational technology class is I didn't want to do, I think it's a common practice to do like a narrated presentation for a lot of our students to showcase what do you understand. But I decided to do a little bit of a flip on it, and I call it becoming the next Bill Nye, the science guy. And the idea of this is the students would take like an Idaho State content standard of any grade from 1st to 12th grade, and they would basically design their own educational video. So kind of like Bert's saying, if you can explain something really easy, then that means you kind of have a pretty good idea about it. And this is something my students struggle, especially as, first or second year students. And so what we start doing is, we always started by watching examples, and we talked about like what makes these videos work. Is there this energy, there's a pacing that's happening, there's visuals, it keeps us engaged. Just because I know that a lot of us consume information through video formatting. And when I ask my students, I'd say 90% is they're just watching a lot of videos. And so the project is they get to create their own video, but it's not about them being video editors. That's not the purpose of this. It's about becoming really good creative communicators. They're going to be teaching students. And so they need to kind of think about, how do I take the standard and how do I make sure that it's clear for my students, that there's structure to it, there's enthusiasm when I'm teaching a lesson. And so the idea is for them to take these standards and make it more age appropriate to a hypothetical grade that they see themselves teaching. And for me, it's not about, I mean, the videos are great, but it's really about the process of designing learning experiences and then learning how to pace themselves when it comes to that. So the first thing that I had to do was I first needed to take that mirror and just to say, okay, is this assignment actually relevant? Am I trying to fit, things that just don't match up? So the first thing I would do is just do an audit of yourself and about your learning outcome, the assignment directions, and how you're evaluating it, and to see if there is a mismatch that's happening. Is your language being consistent from your assignment direction to the rubric? Are you evaluating them on things that you never told them was important at the beginning part? So that's my first recommendation. And what I did for myself is I just wanted to make sure I was consistent in my language usage throughout this whole process. And I just have this example prompt that you can copy and paste your information. But the big thing I would ask you to do is when you end your response, tell AI to list, to number their observations and what they think is going well or not, because it'll serve you in the next component of the prompting. And then the other thing you might ask is ask AI to ask you questions. So perhaps it's confused or maybe it needs some more clarity in order to give you better feedback. And so, I would probe you to do that. Now, the second biggest thing is you'll spit this out and there'll be lots of information that's coming your way. And the thing I would keep in mind is think of it as a menu and not a checklist. You decide what you want to keep in the recommendations. You decide, what you might want to keep. It's like, I like this idea, but I want to tweak it to make it something else, Or you might say, I don't like that suggestion at all, and you toss it. And that's why I think numbering is a really simple strategy, because then the AI won't be as confused as which one you're referring to. So that's my first tip, is to just, look at that component. And then the second question I ask myself is the kind of the scaffolding component. So, okay, I'm feeling good about the language I'm using. I'm feeling good about the rubrics. How can I get them to succeed in this big assignment? I don't just say, design a video, see you later, I'll see you in 5 weeks. I have to guide them through the process. We have to have certain checkpoints. So not only do they not get overwhelmed, but we're building on the actual purpose of the class, which is integrating relevant technology in a timely manner. And so what I do from that is I start thinking about, how can I have AI help me with the scaffolding? How can I have AI help me identify many steps to help bridge them to the next task that this video is requiring? And so what I did from it, this is a 5-week assignment, but this is kind of the steps that are included. And one of the things you should notice, and what I communicate with my students, is these little icons. The icons represent, you can use AI, or if it has a red and a slash, that means no AI going on. And I have a reference to a page in Canvas where it's basically, I'm constantly linking it back in case they need clarification. And one of the things that I learned in my class was they got really stuck at the beginning, and they almost because they had to create a script for a video, most of them are consumers of videos, but never creators of videos. And the idea of having a dialogue, a storyboard, to have intentionality with specific words that would be relevant for this educational video, they would get so overwhelmed at the beginning that they would almost freeze. And what I decided was I'm going to use AI as a component to help with a little bit of a cognitive load at the beginning, because I'm okay if they use AI to inspire their script, because they still have to go and create the video. They have to edit the video. There's a lot of different components to this performance, and I was okay with that. And so this is where my students, they might be teaching an elementary art class, and they're trying to teach them about different styles of art, and they want to narrate it in a Bob Ross kind of style, right? Or maybe they're talking about erosion, but they want to kind of connect it to Southern Idaho, so it makes it more applicable to our students. Or maybe they're teaching an English class and it's a mystery thing. And so it helps them with the script, but then we keep going, and there's basically an offload that we start with AI, we do a little peer, and then a lot of individuality. I have an example I'm not going to play, but when you get access to these slides, you can go ahead and see what this would look like for a student that helped use AI to create a script. but then they went in and they basically did all the heavy lifting on their own. And just to kind of reinforce some of these scaffoldings and some of the things that Joel even brought up at the beginning, when I decided to look at this whole unit that I just loved and I didn't want to give it up on it, is I first started off with like, what's my summative goal? Like, what's the end mind that I want to kind of reinforce? And how do I build each week that builds into this progress of creating a script, having a storyboard, having a rubric so we understand the common language amongst ourselves? We talked about how to use AI, intentionally, and I would give them parameters every single week so then it wouldn't be a guessing game. And the biggest thing is the human feedback was always the anchor. They either got feedback from their peers or from me throughout the process. So it was a dialogue with the assistance of AI. From the student's perspective, like I said earlier, we use AI for their creative thinking. As soon as they start thinking about their subject, they kind of had an idea of maybe a movie or a fun show or something, and they use those things to combine and to create new content. And we talked about that gradual release. It literally goes from AI helping them plan the script to giving some collaborative feedback amongst their peers to then individually that independent creation that would end up being this authentic performance of creating new, engaging educational content that would be age appropriate and aligned with Idaho content standards. And then this last slide is just kind of what's the difference between them. So maybe you've already done the clarification, but maybe you need some scaffolding. And this just kind of helps you be a thinking process for you to decide, am I on phase 1 or am I on phase 2? And where can I pick up from there? And I think that's it. I know we wanted to leave some time for some questions if anybody had it, but it's a really fun way. If you do narrated presentations and you're kind of getting a little bored with it, this could be a really fun way for them to showcase that they understand something in a very simple way.
Thanks, Samara. Oh, that's awesome. So we have a few minutes for questions. Then I can point you to some resources. Let me, actually, while we're at it, let me drop a link to the slides right now so you have those. And then, feel free to raise your hand or drop a question to the chat for any of the catalysts who presented. And then if you have ideas for what you'd like to see more of, like that might also be good feedback. Is there a part of this presentation where like, hey, I would like to see more guidance around, something else?
I just wanted to chime in and say I loved the variety that we saw today. I feel inspired by 3 very different things. These were all great ideas and they all tackled different problems we're facing in assessment. So fantastic work, all 3 of you. And Joel, your intro was great as always.
Thanks, Eliza. Other questions? The chat here. Looks like we have more requests. David asking for some links there. Before we go,
I've got
yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, but Abraham, yeah.
I think, I posted at the beginning, one of the issues I've had is getting students to take seriously the need to be transparent about their AI use. And Joel, I think your intro was great in terms of setting up, and that made me realize I need to do a little bit better job of specifying, what do I expect that you can use AI for on this assignment? How might, and the template, that's a definitely great suggestion. I guess I'm just curious what any of you have run into with students maybe still being resistant to being transparent about their use or that kind of thing, how you encourage them to be more transparent.
Abraham, what I do is I create when I do their assignments, part of the assignment and the point value is the AI reflection. And so a lot of the times I'll go in and say, well, what did you like? What did you omit? What did you disregard? Where, help me understand it. And because it's part of the point value, they're more likely to be more transparent about how they're using it.
Yeah, and I'll jump in there too. I realized through Samra's presentation too that one of my faults is even though using this AI assessment scale can really help communicate to the students what your expectations are of how much they can use. Is this no AI? Is this AI assisted? Is this full AI? Samra had a really great thing with just I mean, I'm just going to steal this idea of just using the icons at each step of the assignment. So it's not just assignment wide, right? Even the assignment is broken up into different parts. And so it's the no AI on this part. This part, you can use AI if you want to, or no AI. This part, I do expect you to use AI, and then you can comment on it. I think that is going to be definitely much more integrated into my workflow. And I really just love the icons as a really quick reference for it instead of just having this long, paragraph discussion of it.
This is so I linked to this in the slides, and then there's also a OER textbook chapter um, that provides like the course syllabus language and then acknowledgement template that you can use in your courses. But this is the acknowledgement template is borrowed from Monash, and Monash like has done a really good job of early on just kind of showing like, hey, this is this is what an acknowledgement statement might look like. But I think like it's I would say beginning with the course, whenever you think like, okay, students might be using AI as part of the submission, and then you've kind of like tagged it, with the AI assessment scale, like just very early on, kind of providing clarity, like, hey, this is what I expect, and then this is where you're going to include this in your submission. Here's what I'm looking for. So there's some maneuverability here. You can say like, hey, provide it. I want to see a chatbot link. Link to the chatbot, but that's not always possible. It depends on what kind of tools students are using. But I think the key is just providing some kind of like structure, telling them where to submit this, and demonstrating what that might look like within your course, right? We have this final slide here. So if you have a Substack, so you'll see like Bert's Substack here, Liza's Substack here, Jen Schneider has a Kreider Substack that kind of updates things. Says like, hey, this is what's going on at Jen Schneider is at BSU, but her Substack does a really good job of showing like, hey, here's what's going on in AI in higher ed and Idaho and at BSU, that kind of stuff. And then Liza, Bert, and Serena have their Substacks. If you have a Substack, kind of a blog that you want us to plug here, we're going to include this in all of our webinars, all of our Catalyst webinars this year. And then we'll have a Canvas kind of instance, up and running pretty soon here, and we'll kind of plug those resources as well. But yeah, let us know or add it to the chat, and we'll add it to the slide. Otherwise, a few ways you can kind of stay plugged into this community. We have this Google group. You can click on that link to join our Google group and get updates there. We also have the OER and AI, or the Opal AI drop-ins link there. The Google Calendar we kind of routinely update, and then some other resources for AI professional development. Otherwise, I'll stick around for a few minutes for questions, but thanks to the presenters and everyone joining. I really appreciate it.
Joel, so you were able to will you get the recording to me?
Yes.
This was so